Hey, readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and this is Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm talking with Caitlin Starling and Genevieve Gornichec, two of the authors of Walk Among Us. This collection of novellas is set in the world of Vampire the Masquerade, the popular horror role-playing game franchise. Each of these three novellas explores the world of the Masquerade from unique and unusual angles. A depressed and lonely college student seeking companionship finds herself groomed for radicalization. An arrogant Silicon Valley data genius seeks eternal life and influence without regard for the price of immortality. And on an Oregon commune, a progressively minded shepherd tends to their human flock, but ethics and appetite are uncomfortable bedfellows at the secret blood farm. Originally published as an audio-only collection, Walk Among Us arrives in print on May 4th from Harper Voyager. And Genevieve and Caitlin, welcome to Fictitious.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I mean, as people who've watched the show for a long time will know, Caitlin was on the show for the Luminous Dead, and I have not been shy over the last couple of years of saying repeatedly that the Luminous Dead has been one of my favorite books of the last couple of years. Right. Obviously, Genevieve agrees. I put that book in people's hands all the time. I talk it up every chance I get. So I'm excited to have you back on. Genevieve, as you and I were talking about before we got started with the interview, you have a book that just came out, your debut novel, The Witch's Heart, which I requested and didn't get, and heads will roll for that. But I'm so excited to have you on the show now so we can talk about this thing that you guys wrote like 3 years ago, right? We'll get into the path for publication for this, but this is such an interesting project because it was audio only first, got released as like, you know, in all the audio places like Audible and stuff like that, and then has showed up as a print collection a year later. So it's been a while since you guys even had your hands on this. So that creates an interesting kind of situation with it as well. But I think it's probably best to talk, first off, I mean, Cassandra Caw was supposed to join us, couldn't for scheduling reasons, to talk about her novella in the collection as well. But that just means more time for you guys. So I think we should probably start off by just kind of talking through what your stories are, the author elevator pitch for it. Genevieve, let's start off with A Sheep Among Wolves. What's that story about?
Sheep Among Wolves is the story of a depressed college student named Clea, who allows herself to be kind of taken in and manipulated by a questionable crowd in the name of feeling a sense of belonging and companionship.
I gotta say that as a story that's set on a college campus, it's been more years than I should admit, but at least 20 since I was an active full-time college student. And it was almost PTSD inducing reading that story because it felt so much like where I recognized, I was like, oh yeah, that felt like my experience. And I mean, I'm super extroverted, so I didn't quite have that same kind of problem. But at the same time, it all felt very real and familiar, and I had no problem putting myself right into it. So thanks for making me feel uncomfortable like that and feeding into those awful college, I'm late for classes and I missed all my courses dreams that I have all the time still at 43 years old.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, I'm about a decade almost out of college, and I felt the same way going back to that place. Like, it was like going back in time in my own memory, and it actually took me a couple weeks to recover afterwards.
I believe that entirely. I mean, you know, college is like one of those like best times of your life kind of thing. But I mean, there's so much stress and anxiety and difficulty, and particularly if you're dealing with any kind of issues while it's going on, which that story touches on a lot too. So, I mean, people should be aware that if it's been a while, they get to experience all the joy of that anxiety and tension all over again. Caitlin, your story in the collection is The Land of Milk and Honey and is radically different from that one. What's that story about?
That story is about a woman named Lee, who is in charge, as you said, of a commune in Portland that is focused around both artistic nurturance and raising sheep and other livestock and crops. And it's a very nice, progressive, idealistic utopia. She does happen to be a vampire. There does happen to be a clandestine blood farm thing going on. Most of the inhabitants are not aware of it. They just think they donate to blood drives a lot. And it's also, so it's about the running of that. It's almost like a farmer's memoir, but it is also about Lee's growing obsession with the newest member of the commune, Robin, and how that maybe distracts her from some political things that are going on right under her nose.
So yeah, couldn't be more different as far as the settings and the approach. And I think it's really worth noting here. I mean, so this is Vampire the Masquerade. If the audience who's listening to this are familiar with Vampire, with the World of Darkness, all those RPGs, they know this is a role-playing game, and it's really a transmedia product because there are video games, there's been TV shows, there's been lots of other kind of adaptions and stuff of it. There's a huge canonical world of story and lore and stuff behind it. And most of the time, Vampire the Masquerade is kind of gothic, sexy, political vampirism, right? Like, it's brutal, it's subtle, it's nuanced, it's emotional stuff. You know, it feeds into a lot of those kind of vampiric tropes. This collection kind of steers in a different direction from a lot of those. I mean, it's definitely in the world of darkness, but it is also kind of at the fringes of it in a lot of ways. I want to dig into really the media tie-in aspect of this because I think that's a big part of what's really interesting about this collection. But I want to know first, like, was that an editorial direction from the beginning? Was that something that your stories kind of developed out in? Were you thinking about, I want to look at this world, but I want to look at it from over here, somewhere distant from kind of the normal stories that take place here?
So we were kind of kept separate at first. We weren't introduced to each other or even told who else was working on the project, I think, for quite a while, at least until at least first drafts were in, I think, later. But from my end, I had almost no direction. I was basically I was told to pitch something that I would like to write in the world, given a whole bunch of resource documents. I was already familiar with the world, but had it read up on the new 5th edition stuff that this is all based off of. And I just sent them idea after idea after idea. And eventually we got to one that we all liked. And both Genevieve and Cass's projects had already been locked down. So they were trying to fit mine in with them. But in terms of being told what to aim for, nope, they just let me run wild.
So I submitted a pitch for the project and then came back with a couple of suggestions. We went back and forth maybe like once or twice, and until we had kind of like a solid pitch. And then I was in. And like Caitlin said, we didn't know each other. Like we weren't introduced or told anything about anybody else's stories or what they were about or who was on the project. And it was interesting to, when we got the first like page proofs or copy edits, I think it was. And that's when I read the 2 other stories. I was like, oh, they're so different, but like there's like similar threads like running through them, I feel like. This was my first rodeo. Like, I don't think I had done copy edits for my debut novel yet at that point. So it was an adventure.
It definitely sounds like it. And I mean, I also think kind of jumping into media tie-in it's such a different world. When you're writing, especially like your first novel where you're doing it on your own, on spec, for basically kind of proving to yourself that you can actually write something before you can actually go out and hunt for publication, versus when you're writing something on a deadline and you actually have, a deal attached to it, but versus writing for a media tie-in because you're answering to the stakeholders, to the people who manage the IP, and that's a whole different thing. I'm curious for you in that process of going back and forth, and I should know this, I should have read this because I came up with Vampire the Masquerade in the White Wolf era, and back in like the late 90s. I know the property from way back in the day. I had the books, I read all this stuff. I never really liked it as a role-playing game, but I really enjoyed it from the lore and the way it was built out. But I don't know where it's really gone over like the last 15 years or so. In that process, were they communicating with you like, oh no, I mean, when we talk about the Camarilla or the Bruja or whoever, like this is what specifically this is like now, you can't put this idea here. I mean, editorially, were they pushing back on some of that? Were there places where you had to kind of course correct the lore?
I always had official lore people available for me to talk to and run ideas by. And in the pitch process, especially because I went through several different plot concepts, we had some back and forth, and they also gave us all the materials ahead of time. So they gave us the whole rule book. So I made sure to read through the new core book before I started really getting into the ideas I was having. Of course, they started immediately. I do remember there was once my pitch had been accepted, and actually once I had written almost all of the first draft, I think, I ended up having a Skype call at 1 a.m. local time with the guys out in Sweden and talking through my pitch. And they didn't know I was that far into the draft. So there were a couple moments where I was like, oh yeah, I've actually already written this. And they were like, oh no, because they didn't want me to have to redo stuff if I didn't have to. But generally it was more like brainstorm vibing, like just tossing out ideas and having fun with it. My understanding of a lot of tie-in projects is that you're often given much firmer rails, at least on either side of you, if not given like a full outline from the beginning. And in this case, they really did, like they picked us as far as I can tell, because they wanted to see what we would do in the world, not so that we could write something that they had already conceived of. There were a couple small course corrections. I think in my case, there was just some discussion about how in-world, like bagged blood, like from a blood bank, is actually not edible to most vampires. And so there were some like logistical questions on the back end. But like there was one point where I asked, okay, do I need to write you up a character sheet of Lee to make sure that everything hangs together? And they were like, no, you don't have to do that. You can fudge it a little bit, even if it would be kind of weird to be able to play this character in game by the rules. But as long as your character is still within the realm of, okay, it feels right, it seems right, it didn't need to be 100% game accurate.
In constructing the collection, were they thinking, okay, we're making something that is really, really tailored for the Vampire the Masquerade audience? Or were they thinking we want something that will equally be appealing for people who maybe have never played the game or never encountered the lore? Was that a consideration that they were talking to you about? Like, did you know, like, oh, here's who we were hitting with it?
Yeah, our editor, David Pomerico, was very, very firmly on the side of this needs to appeal to people who have never read or never played any of the games, never read any of the other tie-in novels, never watched that show, Kindred the Embraced, which real OG fans will remember fondly. One of the bigger changes between my first draft and what's actually in the book is that he had me shift the audience a little bit to people who wouldn't necessarily assume that Lee was a vampire straight off, which to me at first was a little bit confusing because I'm like, well, it says Vampire the Masquerade on the cover. But he's like, no. People who know already, they'll enjoy having the little like wink, wink, nudge, nudge before you do the full reveal. And the people who somehow don't know and haven't figured it out yet are going to enjoy the actual process of the reveal. I was like, okay. And I think he's right that it's definitely not geared at the hardcore fan who's going to know every single term from the first page. But I think it's a approachable, balanced combination.
Yes, I agree. And it was interesting that like alphabetically, my story was first, and my story is the lightest on the lore. Like in my original pitch, like Clea had already been embraced like when the story started. I mean, she doesn't get embraced in the story as it is now, but like the pitch went through a lot of changes because our editor, David, when we were going back and forth with pitches, he was like, okay, I like this part of the pitch, but not so much this part. What if we took this part and just build it out some more? So yeah, it was an interesting process because like Caitlin said, we weren't given like, you need to write this. It was more like, well, what does this world mean to you? What do you want to do with it? So it was really cool.
I do think it's interesting that both of your stories play coy for a while with the vampiric aspect, like Caitlin was saying, because Clea in the first one is encountering people that the reader's going, well, I mean, that guy's clearly a vampire, right? And there's red herrings abound in that first tale. And I think in approaching Caitlin's story, you know, with Lee and those other characters, we pretty quickly were like, no, this isn't just a commune. I mean, these are blood bags, right? They just happen to be paying rent with it this way. But yeah, there is kind of that slow entry into it. Cass's story is not like that. And you jump right in and there's a ghoul and there's a vamp and there's a tech bro who, with her story, I couldn't help but think of like Martin Shkreli, the pharma bro jerk guy, who I'd be perfectly fine seeing eaten alive by vampires, but not cool with him getting eternal life. But that's kind of who was playing through my head. And so like, I was like, you know, it made me slightly uncomfortable actually, because I was like, I don't want to spend time with that guy. But I could see where like that story was going, and we were introduced to you know, the vampirism very early. Did either of you play Vampire before writing the stories? At any point were you actual RPG players, or God forbid, LARPers?
I wanted to be. I had one friend who was also into Vampire the Masquerade, and so that never actually happened. But I definitely, like, I think I just stumbled, maybe my friend introduced me, but I think I just stumbled on some of the books in my local comic shop back in 2004, I want to say. So when I was in high school, and I read a lot of the clan novels at the time. I had all the rule books and I read them. I had the Book of Nod, which gets a funny shout out. In my opinion, it's funny. In Land of Milk and Honey. And so I was kind of just like, and I watched Kindred the Embraced. I had the DVD set and watched it at least twice through. I don't know why. So I was familiar with it. My godmother used to LARP it. She thought it was really cool when she found out I was writing official canonical stuff for it.
I had not played. I didn't really get into RPGs until I was like tabletop RPGs until a couple years back. I just never had any friends who played. And I was always super interested in like the lore and the universe, but it was one of those things where like it just seemed really overwhelming. I'm like, where do I start? There's so much content. And I had no idea where to even begin. So I began with, writing this pitch about based on the core books that we were given, and just kind of went from there. And then I found out later, since we weren't allowed to talk about this with anybody, I found out later that my first dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons, his wife used to play in Columbus by Night, and she had like different mods for her game. And I was like, why didn't I know this? This could have changed everything.
Yeah, because I mean, your story takes place at Ohio State, right? So yeah, so like that could have been really useful.
Right?
Yeah, I went to college at a school that there was a really really vibrant LARPing community, and I had a lot of friends who did it. I wasn't into it myself, but I was around it a lot of times, and I had read the books. I played some of Vampire the Masquerade. So, but what I was always struck with more than anything was that the role playing books were just beautifully illustrated, fantastic storytelling in them. They did a great job of taking the idea of vampiric lore and expanding it in these really fascinating kind of political ways, because there are all these different factions. There's all of this infighting. And of course, now we have a trope. If they're like a labeled trope that is the Masquerade, that idea that there is a hidden world beyond the one we know. So we see it in things like Harry Potter, which literally has a masquerade of the muggles and then the magic folk that kind of hide themselves from the muggles. I'm pretty sure the trope kind of takes right off from Vampire the Masquerade, but that is a core thing of it. The vampires are, walking through the human world, pretending to be human or just moving on the outskirts of it. But I think what that kind of hits too is that vampires are tropey. Tropey. We see it a lot in like urban fantasy and paranormal romance stuff where the tropes get hit really hard with it. With all of the vampiric fiction and films and everything that's come out, it's a big deal with it. For you guys writing these stories, how much were you going, okay, we know the tropes, we need to subvert the tropes, or what do we get to play with? What's the building blocks? Like Genevieve, like you look like you're ready to go there. So like, what was that like for you?
So part of going back in time to my early college years was going back to the stuff that I was reading at the time, like mentally. So yeah, young adult vampire fiction and like the different paranormal and urban fantasies that were coming out at that time. So, I started off with this character who's like, I'm not like other girls, but she really isn't, because she doesn't think there's anything special about her and is just super depressed and has no friends. And then she meets this attractive vampire and like ends up doing his bidding, but not like in a romantic way. So I kind of tried to subvert the stuff that I used to love and the stuff that I used to read.
Caitlin, what was that like for you then going in? Because clearly a progressive farmer vampire doesn't feel like the norm.
It's really interesting. So part of it is that I would never in my life have chosen to play a Toreador, but it was the only clan that made sense for this character I was writing. But it's sort of a slant look at what a Toreador is. And for those of you who have not played Vampire the Masquerade or aren't familiar, Toreador vampires are artistes. They are obsessed with beauty. It's possible to completely basically paralyze them if you show them something pretty enough. They just shut down.
The ooh shiny factor.
Yeah, and usually this is, okay, they're sculptors, they're painters, or they are patrons of the arts, or whatever. And this time I'm like, okay, well, in my opinion, as someone who's obsessed with farming and farming adjacent stuff and handicrafts, that stuff is all art too. And particularly the beauty of a well-run system is also a form of art. So I was almost worried that I would, get feedback of, oh, this character isn't actually reading enough of a Toreador because her interests are so divergent from standard. But instead they were like, absolutely go for it. And so yeah, you get this first person farmer's memoir as if she wants to share the greatest work of her life with you. But in terms of like actual vampire tropes, I didn't really think about them too much beyond the very, very basic and obvious hunger as desire, desire as hunger. That is of course extremely fun to play with, and on a farm that's producing food in particular is very obvious in some ways. But the more I think about it, the vampire stuff I grew up reading was Anne Rice, and all of her characters are dramatic, queer-coded messes, or just straight up queer. And I was so like, in hindsight, Lee fits right in. She makes some highly questionable decisions based on the woman that she falls in love with, and thinks that she is completely in control the entire time, only to learn that she absolutely was not at any point in control.
There's also something I think threads through all of these stories, which is just the consideration for how somebody would choose to spend eternal life. In A Sheep Among Wolves, while we follow a human character to begin with, we do have this character named Finn who has a certain level of activism at the core. And we are at least partially led to believe that Finn does act in a way that, while I wouldn't call it good per se, there is a moral compass at play there for that character. But there's also a fight back against some of these other factions that don't work together very nicely in the vampire world. In the Land of Milk and Honey, you have vampires who have chosen to like you said, there's one of the characters who is old and powerful but just really wants to focus on her art and be left alone, and you have the one who wants to create this sustainable farming community that is as much as possible idealistic and ethical and does right by people, and is trying to balance that on top of the idea that they're bleeding people dry essentially, but renewable resource. That's the thing that's at play there. In Cass's story, it's the idea of somebody who thinks they're the smartest person in the room and wants to stay that way forever. Well, it's essentially sees themselves as if Steve Jobs never died. How would they go forever, managing that power in the shadows, perhaps, after the embrace. But that sense of I will use eternal life in order to stay relevant, to stay in control of the things I create, and to influence life as it goes along. So I thought that as a thematic, again, like what Genevieve was saying earlier, there are echoes across all of them. The stories are all very different, but there are threads that combine between them. We mentioned earlier that the path of publication was interesting because it was audio only to begin with. One, I want to know why. When you were approached for it, did they explain why they were choosing to do something that was audio first? It was just what was going on.
I think I wanted to try it out. I don't remember any specific conversations. My theory has always been that with how popular podcasts are these days, and live play podcasts and stuff, that they were trying to see if a book that was related could also slot into that part of the marketplace. Of course, there's the slight hurdle that audiobooks in fact cost money to listen to. So yeah. I don't know what the results of the experiment were, but that's always been my theory as to why they did it that way.
And I might be misremembering or imagining this, but I believe it had something to do with they wanted to capture more of the gamer crowd, almost the people who were excited for Bloodlines 2. I was really surprised, when my book just came out, how many people told me that they bought the audiobook. I didn't know so many people listen to audiobooks. So I think that they were maybe trying to capture a crowd that wasn't going to sit down and read a book. Because for some people, that's tough. And that's okay. That's why audiobooks exist. So I think, like Caitlin said, I think it was just an experiment, trying to, appeal to maybe a different market than just traditional books.
Yeah, I was also brought on maybe 7 or 8 months before it came out. So I think it also doing an audiobook first, I think shortened the publication timeline because they didn't have to worry about physically printing books. I think that was before Bloodlines 2's release date got bumped out. So I think that was also, it was originally going to be coming out very close to either some big announcements or possibly the game itself, but then things got pushed out for developmental reasons.
Yeah, Bloodlines 2, it still hasn't come out, has it?
No.
Yeah, it's still out there.
It just changed hands to a different developer, is my understanding. Paradox still is doing, I think Paradox is not doing it in-house, and they had originally had it with a particular team elsewhere.
Thinking about then that it was audio first, and Genevieve, you were the baby author going into this. Your debut novel wasn't even out yet. And now you're being told, okay, you're writing for audio first, which means you have to be thinking about the narration and the delivery. What was that like on your end as far as thinking about, and granted, audiobooks get done all the time now, so somebody's eventually going to read them, but this is really that was the point. So what was that consideration like for you, and what kind of feedback were you getting editorially when you were thinking about a narrative performance?
I honestly didn't think about it as much as I should have. I remember Caitlin in an interview later on being like, and I knew it was going to be audio first, so I read it out loud a bunch of times, like to practice. And I was like, what? Should we have done that? I'm such a baby. Oh God, but Erica Ishii did such an amazing job. Like, oh.
Caitlin, was Luminous Dead out already at the point when this was being done?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Luminous Dead. So Luminous Dead came out in April 2019, and I was brought on in October of 2019, I think.
You'd already had the experience of hearing an audiobook read of your stuff and everything too. Did that have an influence?
Kind of. I didn't actually listen to the Luminous Dead's audiobook because I get terrified that I'm going to hear an error of mine that I didn't catch. And it's so stressful. I have this great photo of the day that it became available to put a pre-hold on at my library. My husband found it and played the sample, and it was like the first time I'd heard any of my audiobook. And I've just buried myself in a blanket and screamed. There's this great photo of just my face peeking out, which my Luminous Dead audiobook is fantastic by all accounts. Everyone who's listened to it has told me it's great. I just personally can't listen to it because I get really nervous. But what I had run into was that I think it was John Scalzi who had mentioned that, his books do very well in audio. And he had noticed that, and he says, if you look at his early books compared to currently, he drops a lot of the dialogue tags because you don't want to hear he said constantly in an audiobook, because in print, it disappears. Mm-hmm. And in audio, it's very, very noticeable because it becomes rhythmic. And just, he made a couple comments about that somewhere, probably either on Twitter or on his blog. And so I had those in the back of my head. I had when I did my past pages for the Luminous Dead, I had already seen that. So I did a little bit I read it out loud, mostly to catch typos, because you catch typos better if you're reading it out loud. But I also noticed when stuff sounded weird or repetitive, or the prosody of it was off, and I would just make little changes. I'm sure David, my editor, loved getting back past pages with that many tweaks on it, because it didn't actually work substantive, but I was like, oh, this could be better. And then for this project, I started reading it out loud a lot sooner. Instead of waiting until past pages, I think I did it just to do my edits, which normally isn't worth the time investment because you change so much in edits. But in this case, it made sure that it was voicey enough, and that Lee had a particular sound to her, that whoever ended up voicing it, which XE Sands ended up voicing it phenomenally.
I do want to note something too, that in the Land of Milk and Honey, that Lee, the main character who is our POV character, isn't explicitly gendered initially in the story. And I felt in reading it, where I was there's almost a sense of not self-insert for the reader, but in a way, there was a kind of a you don't know. I mean, that there's this woman Robin that they're interested in, but initially I was we're X percentage into the story, and we don't have that out explicitly hit over the head.
I don't think it's actually brought up until Lee is, after a particularly disastrous meeting with one of her bosses, goes to a club and picks up a hapless tech bro and is I'm just gonna, you know what straight guys are always obsessed with? Queer girl tits. So I'm just gonna unbutton my jacket and he will follow me right out of this room, which he does. And I think that's the first time where it actually comes up that Lee, Lee does identify as female in my head, but I think in the story you can still just make an argument that Lee knows that they read as a certain gender in, to the average person. But yeah, in my head that she's a woman and she's a lesbian. But yeah, I did specifically choose a gender neutral or gender ambiguous name. It's always really weird to me when in a first person book, you have someone commenting on their gender, because I guess to me, it's just what I am. And so it's not part of my usual self narration. So it just, it didn't come up. It seemed fun to play with. And
there's that, I mean, YA is criminally guilty of this, but it happens in books all the time, where a first person POV has to take that moment where they stop and look at themselves in the mirror and be like, oh, my tousled hair and my unshaven face, or my whatever the thing. And it's And I am the kind of reader who I do want to know what a character looks like, generally speaking. Like, I get frustrated sometimes, like in the tradition of things like Tolkien, where I'm like, oh, we have visions of what the characters look like because a lot of artists interpreted them, but the book doesn't tell you a damn thing. You know, they're just like, here's some elves, there's some hobbits, they're short and they have hairy feet. That's good enough, right? So I do like to have like sometimes a visual sense, but there's something about the ambiguity sometimes that's really fun and playful as well, where you get a little extra time to kind of. There's a moment with Lee where she meets this Duskborn who comes in and she bares her fangs at him and he almost pisses himself. It's played in kind of an ambiguous fashion that you like. She could be 10 feet tall. She could be like a massive brujah. Like, you just don't know in that moment. All you know is that she is absolutely terrifying, and that guy knows he could die in a second if he plays his cards wrong. And I liked that. I liked that kind of left that moment of being like, I don't know what he's seeing offhand. I just know that whatever it is, it's absolutely horrifying. And that played well. And I think that probably, and I read this in Kindle, so I don't know what the audio version sounds like, but I imagine that moment probably worked pretty well in that way. Moving aside from all of that stuff, let's talk about craft here. Again, with the caveat that you guys wrote these stories a couple of years ago. It's been a minute. So I want to talk in general. And in Caitlin, we've touched on some of this before when you were on the show, a couple of years ago now. But so I want to look at it from your standpoint, and like I said, as a developing writer who's has several books out and has another one coming. But for Genevieve, you just had your debut novel drop. I imagine that you're working on the next stuff now. What does your writing process look like? Are you an outliner, a pantser, combination of the two, discovery writer? Do you have your own fancy word for it? What's that look like?
100% pantser. 100%. So for this project, I had to make an outline, based on my pitch, basically, just because I was working so closely with David to develop it. And that was an experience, both being under contract for the first time and having to write off an outline because I am a pantser, to my core, to my own detriment, because it makes revisions an adventure. But so this was just like a whole different ball game for me.
Did you have to turn in an outline for this story? I mean, for a novella, I feel like, it's a shorter piece, so it's a different kind of construction, but usually with media tie-ins, an outline is required. Do you remember if that was a thing you had to do, or is it just a premise pitch?
It was kind of part of my pitch, just because when we were building out the different concepts, saying okay, I like this, I don't like this, let's bring this out more. We kind of did a play-by-play of what that would look like. So I would refer back to the pitch constantly when I was going through, okay, here's what's going to happen. I'm just going to graffiti that building and then she's going to burn a house down. So, but usually when I sit down to write a story, I really don't know what's going to happen until I write it. So totally different process here.
Caitlin, I remember from The Luminous Dead that novel went through enormous changes. What does your writing process look like now? Have you developed into more and more of an outliner? Is that changed? Discovery writing, bigger part of the process? What's it look like now?
I go from having a vague outline to, as I reach new parts of the story, I will tend to outline in just spots, just to kind of give me a roadmap to get through the next scene or two, especially if they're complex and there's a lot going on. But I still largely figure out within a scene what's going to happen, or within maybe a set of 3 or 4 scenes, what'll happen as I'm writing it. So with The Land of Milk and Honey in particular, I had a very vague outline that I submitted along with the pitch that got approved. Extremely vague, it was basically just the concept with a slight amount of chronology in it. And that ended up working really well because The Land of Milk and Honey is such a voicey story. It's so reliant on what Lee is in the mood to tell the listener that it was a lot of writing her sections were just vibing, and I would get bits of dialogue of just a monologue, I guess, of Lee's voice just going over certain things, and I would just go from there and then figure out plot wise what needed to happen either as the main event of that scene or kind of in the background of the scene. There are a lot of scenes where what Lee is focused on is not what actually is important to the story. Which was fun to play around with. Since then, my process has gotten even weirder. the most recent project that I finished a draft on, which is known on Twitter as Fucky Bee's book. Actual working title is now The Starving Saints, which has not sold anywhere yet. It's not yet going to be available for pre-order. No idea what's going to happen with it, but I love it very much. And I wrote that thing technically in chronological order on a chapter level, but within each scene, I just wrote it completely out of order to the extent that on the final couple of chapters, I would write like a sentence that was a third of the way through, then do a sentence at the end of the scene, then go back to the beginning of the scene and write maybe like a paragraph, and then go in the middle of the other two and write something, and slowly stitch them together. And on the really tricky ones of that, I would have like this is a list of things that need to happen, and this is where it starts and ends up, just to make sure that I didn't miss anything. I say I don't know why I did this. I do kind of know why I did this. The answer is anxiety. I was getting too in my head, and like writing chronologically straight through a scene was suddenly very intimidating to me, because this was actually the Lighted Book and Honey was the first book I ever wrote on contract, technically. But this is the first full-length original novel that I've written since signing with my agent, because The Death of Jane Lawrence was already written when I signed with her to some extent. It then went through changes, obviously. But so this was my, wait a minute, can I actually do this book? So I just went berserker mode on it in such a way that I couldn't get scared as much, because I didn't know where I was.
That description might drive me to drink, but if it works for you, that's good stuff.
It worked this time. I hope I can write linearly next time, because it's a lot easier to tell where you are. But I mean, containing it mostly to within a scene, sometimes there would be like 3 scenes I was working on at once, but they were all chronologically adjacent to each other. That still gave it some structure. And I did in my Scrivener document, like I had all the scenes blocked out with rough conceptual titles. And I did have an ongoing outline. Some of it was after the fact that I just filled back in once I knew what I'd written. But I had one of those going in my usual OneNote document, often with question marks and what the hell are you thinking, Caitlin, and lots of notes.
I love those.
I was trying to keep it organized.
So you mentioned there you're using Scrivener and OneNote.
Mm-hmm.
Genevieve, what are your tools of the trade? What are you writing in?
Microsoft Word and nothing else.
That's intimidating.
I'm also a very linear writer, though. And like, while I am a pantser, I usually have like a vague idea what's going to happen. So like for the book I'm working on now, which also hasn't like, it's not official or anything. It's just something I'm working on. But like, I know how it's going to end. I don't know anything else. I don't know how we get there. So it's going to be a journey of discovery along the way in my Word document.
That's the Microsoft Word is another one of those things that would drive me to drink. But again, everybody's methodology is a different thing, and I'm a Scrivener user, and probably there's almost too much to play with in there sometimes, as far as like getting.
I don't use most of the features.
Oh yeah.
I did finally learn how to color code scenes this time, just so I could see if I was having any pileups, because I have 3 POVs in the new project, which, if you've read my stuff, I've never done. I always focus on one person. So now there's 3 POVs, and I was like, okay, from the beginning, I want to make sure that there's a smooth balance and handoff. And when someone's POV goes away for a while, it's intentional. And the color coding on that is very useful. You can see right away if you have just put 3 or 4 POV scenes of just 2 characters in a row, and the third one is just off doing something.
That's definitely a brilliant piece of advice that I've encountered from a few different authors, some that use it for the POVs. I had an author on at one point who talked about how when she writes like paranormal romances, and she would color code the chapters that are more romance focused, or the ones that are more action focused, or have more story beats or whatever, so that she could see, okay, I'm keeping the balance, that I have the energy of the action, but I have the romance that the audience is coming in for, and back and forth, and being able to see that visually, it can be really, really helpful as far as figuring out the balance of your story. So I think that makes a lot of sense. We spent a lot of time talking about Walk Among Us. And I have to keep stopping myself from just saying Among Us and getting it confused with that video game that took over, which is highly sus. But Walk Among Us is out in the world. It's been out for a while in audio, now arriving on May 4th in this compiled actual physical format for these stories. So you can get it all the places. Genevieve, your debut novel just dropped a few months ago with The Witch's Heart. Can you kind of just give us a brief overview of what that book is about, so people can check that out as well?
The Witch's Heart is a reimagining of Norse mythology from the perspective of the giantess Angrboda, who is the mother of 3 very unusual children by the trickster god Loki. And yeah, it came out February 9th in the US and will be out in the UK on May 4th.
So you have a big day coming, that one.
Oh, yeah.
That's always so confusing to me whenever you've got multiple places where they're coming out and they get the different covers. Every once in a while, like the UK will get really, really cool covers that I wish I could get my hands on, and I get mad because they're not the ones I had.
One day I'll get a UK edition of something and get one of those good UK covers. I love my US covers, but the UK covers are just something about them.
Yeah, there's something special happening over there a lot of the time. Caitlin, obviously we've talked a lot about the Luminous Dead. Yellow Jasmine is out in the world. The Death of Jane Lawrence is coming here soon. It's got this really amazing kind of body horror-ish cover. Clearly Genevieve has feels about it. Feels. So what can you tell us about that? Because I mean that's in October, it comes out like a week or so after my birthday, so I'm taking that as a personal gift to me. But I'm hoping to get it as an early birthday gift, so we can talk about it later on. But just briefly, what is that story about?
Yes, so The Death of Jane Lawrence, it's coming out October 19th from St. Martin's Press in hardcover. It'll be my first hardcover book. It's very exciting. Yeah. And it is about you can see the cover. See if I remember which side I put it on. This side, yes. You can vaguely see the cover back here. But it is the story of a woman named Jane Lawrence Jane Shoringfield, who decides that what she needs is a marriage of convenience. She picks from all of her options a young bachelor doctor who, a little bit of a question as to why he's single, but he is, and he agrees to have a business arrangement of a marriage, except then they promptly fall in love and everything becomes a huge mess. The problem is that Augustine Lawrence has an ancestral home that he's like, well, Jane, you never need to go there. You'll just never go there. It'll be fine. Everything will be fine. And then, of course, she ends up there and it's haunted. And that's actually kind of the least of the problems. And it's Victorian era surgery. There's 6 abdominal surgeries in it. I counted finally. It's Victorian style occultism and esoteric magic. There is some fundamental calculus theory involved as well. And overall, it's gothic horror and super weird.
Are you going to make me do math when I read this one?
Only a little bit. You just need to think about the concept of 0, which is a very weird number that is not actually a number. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I can get behind that. As long as I don't have to do... I mean, I don't mind working in a story, but if you make me do computational math, we're going to have problems.
I think when I actually talk about doing integrations, I don't use that word. And so I think it won't trigger the, oh God, no calculus feelings in most people.
Okay. Okay, well, that is good to note. I'm very excited for that one. And I'm also excited to get my hands on The Witch's Heart because I have not done that yet either. But that also sounds fascinating to me. You guys are playing some really fun stuff in those novels, and I'm excited for it. Like I said before, at the time, this will be dropping like pretty much the day before Walk Among Us appears on shelves in e-readers. And so I'm hoping people will go and check this out, whether they're fans of the Vampire the Masquerade franchise, or if they're new to it and they're looking for a new take on the vampire lore and some new perspectives. Going forward, where should people follow you online so they can keep up with you? Genevieve, where are you at on all the places so people can keep up?
I am at Jen Gornichec on Twitter and Instagram, both. I post a lot about history and Viking reenactment, which I do. So my Vampire the Masquerade novella is a lot different than anything I've ever done and probably will ever do. So maybe don't expect a lot besides Viking nonsense on my social medias.
I love that Viking nonsense is your brand, but that's pretty rad. Caitlin, what about you? Where are you at all the places?
I'm most active on Twitter at CSEE_Starling. I also am occasionally on Instagram at author C Starling, and my website is just CaitlinStarling.com. You can see all of my lovely covers in high def. I have some really good covers.
You do. And you have a lot of interesting commentary on your fucky bees. So
yeah.
So that's definitely something for people to look forward to as well. So
fucky bees and cannibalism. Also, if you dig, you can find a link to my Hannibal fan Twitter.
Oh yeah, I forgot that you were talking about that stuff as well. Yeah, there's a little something for everybody in all of that right there. So I think that's great. Well, I hope everybody goes and checks out your stuff, checks out this collection, looks into everything else. Shout out to Cassandra Kaw, who couldn't be on the show but is in this collection as well. She's got a very interesting book coming up called All the Blackened Teeth.
Nothing but Blackened Teeth.
Nothing but Blackened Teeth. Thank you. That has a really great, super creepy cover. That will keep you up at night just even looking at the cover art for it. But that one seems very cool. So I'm hoping I get Cass on the show at some point as well. But Genevieve and Caitlin, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Thanks for having us.